This is a Chicago 2-flat. It's a building that sits on a standard residential lot with apartments, each roughly the same layout, stacked one on top of the other. 1/4 of Chicago lives in one of these or its three-tiered cousin. While Chicago's unique in calling them 3-flats, these are fairly similar to buildings that you might find in lots of other cities. Boston has triple-deckers, New York has brownstones, and West Coast cities like San Francisco, they have their styles too. Each of these cities' takes has its own unique quirks, and I want to understand exactly how and why they're so different. This is more than just an interesting exercise to compare and contrast. Recently, folks are coming to recognize just how important these buildings are to their cities and the people who live in them. In many cases, these structures offer on-ramps for home ownership and building equity and wealth. They can encourage and develop strong neighborhoods, maybe even familial bonds if generations remain living together. And most importantly, these buildings might be the key for solving the mounting housing challenges that we're facing in cities today. And I think that's why cities around the United States and elsewhere, they're racing to protect and preserve these structures that are there. In some cases, municipalities are even looking to encourage construction of new versions of these old kinds of buildings. But in the wrong hands, these buildings are susceptible to actually exacerbating problematic trends that can just decimate neighborhoods. They can be converted into single-family homes pretty easily, eliminating 3 affordable housing units for a single luxurious one, for instance. And because families, they tend to hold on to these buildings longer. After a death in the family, they might sell for cheaper than usual, and since they haven't been updated for decades. That makes it easier to just tear one of these down where the land values are high. In Chicago, that's led to losing up to 15% of these buildings between 2013 and 2019 in some neighborhoods. In these cases, that instead of just gently encouraging more density like we want, it just serves to increase land values until longtime residents are forced out, and it ends up solving nothing in the end. It's really important, I think, to understand the dynamics of all of this so that we get this right. So let's focus on 3 examples from 3 cities to understand what's going on here. To the east, we'll look at this one in Boston. It's in the Ashmont neighborhood south of downtown. In the middle, we'll look at a north side 2-flat here in the Edgewater neighborhood of Chicago. And our west coast example will be located in the Fillmore neighborhood of San Francisco. I think you'll be fascinated with just how different these similar looking buildings are from one another and how they ended up just being so different in the end. Let's start here in Chicago, because that's what we do here. This building is located at the border of Edgewater and Andersonville neighborhoods. It's made of brick and stone, lining a wood-framed structure. There are 2 types of brick, one for presentation on the front facade, made and shipped in from Wisconsin. Then the locally produced Chicago Common brick is reserved for the sides, where it won't normally be seen. The stone, limestone, which can come in longer pieces than bricks, is used for headers bearing the weight of bricks above. The design of the building carries these beige lines of limestone horizontally across the facade, which then also becomes the line where different materials shift and meet. It's also used in blocks at the bottom, which helps shift the visual weight of the overall building downward, making it feel planted and sturdy in the earth. At the front, there's a porch and a 3-sided bay window. It extends all the way from the ground all the way up to the parapet, the vertical extension that hides the flat roof behind it. Walking up the stairs and standing on the porch puts you at the same level as the first floor apartment. Below this area is a basement whose floor is a little over a meter below the ground level. This depth is important because foundations need to reach a set of soil that will never freeze. The frost line is the height at which this occurs, and in Chicago, it's about 42 inches down. Building the foundation requires digging anyway, so it's actually less work to just leave this area under the building empty rather than having to fill it back in. At that point, just raising the first floor just a few feet will give you an occupiable space down there. And then windows line that ground level to let in light down in the basement and provide like an exit in case of an emergency. Most of the time, zoning codes don't actually allow for this space to be used as another apartment. That's not usually because it's unsafe. It's instead because the codes were changed in order to prevent more density in the neighborhood. More about that later. Anyway, moving inside, you'll notice that every room has a window, but the more public spaces like the living room and the dining room, they have bay windows or are pushed out a little bit. On the side, this allows more light to enter without giving the neighbor a direct view into any of these spaces. The other windows that just look at the wall of their neighbor is mostly just for airflow and exiting during an emergency, but it does let in some reflected light here and there. This one is a 2-bedroom, single-bath unit, with the bathroom sharing a wet wall with the kitchen so that the plumbing can stack easily. This is pretty much the norm. The plan is also divided roughly in half, with the more public spaces on one side and the more private ones like bedrooms on the other. The linear arrangement allows the walls in the other direction to act structurally, so it holds up the floors above, so they don't have to span the full width of the house, but basically reaches the full width of the lot. Meanwhile, people circulate along a spine that goes in the other direction, or lengthwise, marked by stairways on either end. The front staircase connects to a common vestibule and spirals up in what's known as a winder stair. That's when the corners angle like this. On upper floors, the area above the vestibule provides space for another little room. This example too has a garage at the back. For many 2 and 3 flats in Chicago, these were added after the house was built. Cars were only just becoming a standard staple. And as you will see, these kinds of buildings in all 3 cities that we're looking at were actually developed as their neighborhoods became served by streetcars in the early 1900s. Originally, a Scandinavian family bought this lot for $4,500, and they used this as collateral for the developer to construct the house. The family chose this design from a handful of possible other design options, which were designed by a pretty great architect that worked alongside Frank Lloyd Wright for a few years. That's how this area was able to develop with such a cohesive and a consistent aesthetic. The multi-unit configuration allowed the family to just be able to afford a house and to build equity while gathering rent while their kids grew up. Then as the family continued to grow, they were able to age in place and live in the same house. 2 flats helped create a strong family and neighborhood bonds, as the 2-flat was an integral part of a cohesive neighborhood plan. And that's all very different from this Boston triple-decker in the Ashmont area of the Dorchester neighborhood. These actually get their name from the English ship, which had 3 decks of guns. There were 15,000 of these kinds of buildings built in this area after it became accessible with the streetcar that came down Dorchester Avenue around the turn of the century. People from all kinds of backgrounds decided to settle in this neighborhood. You had the Catholic Church, which was a big draw, and because Boston's growth didn't follow a grid pattern, the lots themselves come in all shapes and sizes too. This area is also just outside the jurisdiction of the fire laws that governed Boston at the time, so triple-deckers could be made out of wood instead of brick like in Chicago. Wood was also more popular here in Boston than in Chicago because of practices that carried over from its long history in its settler days. Originally, a builder with an entrepreneurial spirit decided to purchase this land in 1915 to subdivide it and build triple-deckers to rent to families. He hired the architect James Beckwith to design the new building. Beckwith had been studying versions of these across the city, and these had developed earlier without any architects in hand, just as a loose collection of tradesmen who were working together and sharing knowledge with one another. But they were all working on this common solution to a problem that was occurring across the city. These early versions didn't have any real ornament to speak of, but Beckwith was experimenting with a colonial revival style that was popular in the other parts of the city. That's the style of the large ornate columns and the projecting cornice that you see on this one. Like the Chicago 2-flat, it has a bay window, and instead of 1 porch on the front, it has 3, 1 for each unit. There's also 1 common entrance, just like the Chicago version, that leads to a winder stair. It too has 2 bedrooms per floor with the plan divided in half. The walls running the length are load-bearing, and the kitchen and the bath share a wall here too. What's different from the Chicago version is that the dining room is actually separated across the hallway from the kitchen, which puts the two a little bit closer together, but while at the same time maintaining their overall separation. In the Chicago version, you have to skip past the full length of the bathroom in between the two. Another major difference is outside. In comparison to the Chicago lot, which is long and narrow with an alley behind it, the Boston version is wide and squat and has no alley. The buildings come right up to the sidewalk with no front yard in between, and there's no place for a garage in the back. At the same time, the wooden balloon frame construction of these buildings proved to be a huge liability in dense concentrations like you find them here. They became illegal to build after 1930, and many fell into disrepair as the neighborhoods couldn't adapt very easily. And that's probably why Will Hunting lived in one, to make the fictional genius's situation feel a little bit more inescapable. Out west in San Francisco, these kinds of units are also really expensive, but they'd work a little bit differently. This one was built about the same time as the other buildings we've been looking at. It's made out of wood, and it's in a combination of Italianate and Victorian styles with intricate wooden carving on the outside. The name Painted Ladies describes the often multicolored schemes that are found on the front facades. This became a hallmark of homes in San Francisco, which is largely a city conceived of as single-family homes. The pressure to densify beyond that only came since the 1950s or so. and tens of thousands of these kinds of buildings were being bulldozed to make way for more dense kinds of housing. At the same time, the entrepreneurs began buying these and using surplus gray paint from battleships on the outside, where they carved up the interiors into multiple different units. And that's what happened here. The original larger house was subdivided after it was initially built. And since its 1950s gray wash, it's taken on multiple different kinds of color schemes since then. You'll also notice that they solved the garage problem that Boston couldn't quite handle by converting the first floor to be a place for the car. San Francisco doesn't need underground basements because the soil doesn't really freeze here. The garage dumps right onto the street, crossing over the sidewalk. And in this case, the first floor is also where the apartment unit sits. Converting the house into units after the fact presents a couple different challenges. The first is getting to each unit. Examples like this typically have separate entrances for each one, rather than a common interior vestibule like the other two that we've looked at. It also means that there isn't such a standardized set of layouts across various examples. You could find that Chicago solution almost everywhere. It's the common solution to solving a set of problems that go along with the 24 by 125 foot lot. So here in San Francisco, some of the examples split the house from each floor, but some might be from front to back. This one is kind of both really, as their one unit is fully contained on the back half of the building on the first floor. So as a result of this history, there's usually more of a wider disparity between the quality and the level of luxuriousness between the units that are inside of the building, instead of all the units being equal like you have in Chicago and in Boston. And in fact, the triple-decker was actually called a democratic housing type, which is definitely not the case here in San Francisco. Anyway, the small two-bedroom unit behind the garage, it's complemented by the comparably luxurious two-story owner's unit that hovers above it. The primary unit has accommodations like a butler's pantry, thanks to its aristocratic past. The plan also only squeezes rooms into one side of the plan, rather than splitting it down the middle with a hallway like in the other cities. So even though this house sits on a lot that's the exact same width as the Chicago version, rooms like bedrooms could be much bigger inside. Today, these buildings have lived through a series of efforts to try and save them and repaint them in all sorts of vibrant colors, and they've survived multiple phases of renovation as the city continues to face housing shortages and extreme inflation of home values. These are heavily protected by preservation interests in order to maintain the city's character. But they're also being looked at really closely as cities are trying to wrestle with how to build density without erasing what's already there. While buildings like 2 and 3 flats hold a ton of promise for building and easing into more density, there are a ton of challenges that go with that. For one, older zoning codes get in the way by disallowing anything more than just single-family homes on a lot in a residential area. At the same time, today's economics of construction can make this all a huge challenge. A 2 or a 3-bedroom unit will likely cost well over $1 million to build in any one of these cities. At current mortgage rates, that makes it almost mandatory that any of these new apartments bring top market rates to pay off the mortgage. So any new kind of version of this is really going to struggle with trying to provide any kind of affordable middle-class housing solution directly. There's work being done on this on all sides to rectify it though, like groups who are trying to abolish R1 zoning entirely, which is what prohibits building more than just one unit on a single lot. Still others are trying to find ways of building more cheaply and economically, maybe with factory-built structures. These can take advantage of the repeatability to provide higher quality by taking advantage of larger scales of production. There's even federal initiatives like the one called Pro Housing, or Pathways to Removing Obstacles, which incentivize affordable rental units financially. There's a lot of work to do just to get back to the point where these kinds of buildings make any sense to build. And if you're like me and interested in digging deeper into these forces that shape our homes and cities and infrastructure, I think that you really enjoyed Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service that's built by creators for curious minds like ours. Think of it like Netflix for people who like architecture and engineering. For instance, in City Nerd's recent video, Ray Delahanty takes us through the imbalances of financing between cities and their rural surroundings, and which one is subsidizing the other. It's really great, in a nerdy way. On Nebula, you'll find exclusive content and extended editions of videos that you might love on YouTube with extra content on it, and you'll find original series that you won't find anywhere else. My current favorite is Neo's Underexposure, where Neo sets his documentary-style storytelling and his amazing graphics on some of the most intricate world events. By joining Nebula, you're not just gaining access to all this content, you're actually directly supporting independent creators because you're allowing us to make the content that we love. That's why there are multiple ways to join. So you could choose whichever way is right for you. When you're paying for a year with my 40% discount, it works out to only about like a cup of coffee per month. Or if you're already signed up, maybe you could just consider giving a gift as a membership to a loved one. Or finally, there's also the lifetime option if you're someone that's looking to build a long-term relationship by supporting this channel in the absolutely most generous way possible. So if you're ready to discover more of the ideas that are lurking behind how we live, head over to the link in the description and receive 40% off of Nebula today just by using that link. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you over there.